Out the one and only, no, well, actually the second one from the phone presentation in our meeting. Welcome everyone. This is a spring break, so lots more work can be done because new lessons and classes are not there. Jourdan.
Thank you so much for attending. My name is Jourdan Clemsen, and today I'm going to be summarizing the paper Extensive Childhood Experience Pokemon's just eccentricity drives the organizational and visual cortex. So, where should we get started first? Well, not to oversimplify things, but early brain development leads to essentially the cell differentiation in the brain that builds up over time and leads to the connection of and the wiring initially of neural circuits. I'm sure we know a little bit about that. This usually occurs usually until late adolescence, 14 for boys and supposedly 10 for females. Obviously, this varies from person to person. When do we, or even the idea of if we ever stop, whether these circuitries ever stop developing to begin with. This is I'm going to make it clear this is at the whole brain neuroplasticity because obviously it's much later, like 25 or so. But this is the specific region that I'm referring to in this paper. This occurs, and then obviously selective pruning destroys or I guess corrects certain neural circuitry in the brain that leads to after adolescence that leads to actually use in this the plasticity of the brain itself. And for the sake of this paper, we're going to be mainly focusing on the ventral temporal sulcus for childhood experience itself, and its relationship of the psychosocial culture and how the environmental stimuli influences the neuroplasticity of this region. So we're also going to be focusing on the fusiform sulcus itself, and comparing to the lateral and the medial forms of the fusiform sulcus, and seeing how what type of stimuli influence its development over time. Okay, so this paper discussed initially, it's trying to look back at and test a theory that has been discussed. It's clearly known that people that the region and the connection and the connections of certain components of the ventral temporal sulcus actually occur in infancy. However, the location itself, what actually organizes within the VTC itself actually is dependent, supposedly dependent on the environmental stimuli that we occur. So one leading theory was why this what drives this is the eccentricity bias, which is essentially things that we see in our peripheral versus central that we foveate on versus peripheral vision actually helps drive the organization of this region of the brain. This what would influence this is location and size. Obviously things are more towards the center of my vision. I'm going to be focused on this a little bit more than like the pizza way over there. And so I'm probably not going to focus on that as much. And there'd be less stimuli, which then leads to less reinforcement of the region. This has been essentially just proven to be affected by previous studies. The paper itself cites one that's about macaws. It mentions macaws, but there's been other ones that cites about one in Germany about one-eyed kittens and how that the limitation of sight itself actually influenced the development of this region as well. So
in the one-eyed kittens, yeah. Are they more eccentric because there's only one eye and they have to like get field of view? Or...
So actually, it was less malleable. If that makes sense, because there was it was just one eye, but because there was like you had double with both eyes, it was less malleable over time. So it did change a little bit, but they showed that the rate just basically decreased based on by 2, if you could see, which would assume to be an eye. So that made a little bit more sense, because I guess we'd have 2 inputs for affecting this region versus just 1. And then 2 lesser extents of the input, whether it's peripheral versus something we can foveate on. Obviously this skill is instrumental in learning to read and face recognition itself, because the connections that we develop through this region actually are influential for that as well. Okay, so now that we went over what they're trying to test, I guess, and explore in the paper. So what they use as an instrument to explore this area is that there's the phenomenon. I think it was a Stanford student doing his PhD thesis in 2015, I think it was published. Just thought that would be instrumental to use this the Pokemon mania that occurred in 1996 for a way to measure this. So in 1996, there was a huge phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon that impacted the United States. I think some sociologists refer to it as Pokemania. Essentially, there was he thought that he could use the handheld playing device with the screen from the Game Boy. He refers to it just as the Game Boy. I'm assuming he means the Game Boy Advance too, but he refers to it because the limited screen size itself and the pixels of about 2.5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters, and the reward that we got from because the game actually relies on you to accurately assess and identify the categorization of what you're seeing, and then apply that in a problem-solving sense to figure out how to essentially just defeat Pokemon. He thought that was an interesting, it would be a great way to test his theory of eccentricity in the brain. He wanted to make sure clear. It also was really instrumental and useful because these objects are not physical and they're not animated, but they can be perceived that way, which will block for other things. Like I see Sergey right here, and I know that he's physical. He's not an abstract construct, and I'm aware that I'm not perceiving him as fake. He's not a figment of my imagination. I'm assuming you guys are seeing him too. So essentially, those 2 things are crucial because there's a little bit of interaction between perception versus sensory. Also, it's not location or face based. Because while you can use it for facial recognition, it's important to block for that in this specific study. Also, if it was location based, it'll be a different area of the brain because it's where it can be more spatial and perhaps even episodic. So, granted that he had these tools available to him, the methods that he had. So the methods in this paper, was essentially he found 11 adults who played the game from ages ranging from 5 to 8, and all of them were still playing into adulthood. Were extracted from the study. He had 3 females tested, and part of the way that they screened this, it was self-reported at the first stage, and then later on they did actually test them by naming 40 Pokemon at random. And then once that was passed and cleared, they did actually put them in an fMRI. They would show them animals, Pokemon, human faces, cartoons, words, cards, body scorers, and cars, and all this other stuff to differentiate between the 2. He would have them report back to, and he would have them obviously do an oddball test too in the background just to make sure they're actually paying attention to what they're seeing. And then he mapped out the responses of basically using multivoxel pattern analysis and of the ventral temporal cortex. Okay, and then so it's important to note too that he did report that all these every single one of the images had to be of the same basically the same pixels and hertz. So it was presented at 2 hertz itself. I went over that they had an oddball concentration cast, but I want to make it clear that it was different from the stimuli that they were seeing. So it was obviously blocked, but they wanted to make sure that it was just essentially there to make sure they were continuously paying attention to the images and looking at them. But also so just measuring working memory, if that makes sense. The replicability of this, they did these patterns 6 times, and they had controls associated with 11 other people who played the game. With 7 females and 4 males. And he defines a lot of these variables and the terms I'm going to use more in to great length later on. But for this one, he describes a novice or a Pokemon negative group, as I refer to it in this presentation, as somebody who has never played the game, if that makes sense. So they probably could have heard about it or something. So yeah. Sorry.
I never played.
And here's what he showed them, I guess, essentially in the presentation itself on the right, for the people online, is during the MRI. During the screening stage himself, he graphed out what they actually were able to see. And showed that, and he demonstrated that the amount of chance that people were able to actually name these Pokemon, because he had to actually prove that these people have actually seen the Pokemon itself, for reasons that will be explained, that will become apparent, much more apparent later on in the presentation, when he has to be really concise with what he's measuring, because of unexpected discoveries, which is exciting. As you can see, the people who self-reported were honest. He did.
Well, they named 40 types of Pokemon.
Strong right.
That's it.
I mean, why would you lie about that? That's what I was thinking. And also, like, the age was like 24, I think, for his experimental group. So, I mean, I'm assuming that they were just his friends with standard deviation of 2. So it's probably just one. I'm assuming they were just his close friends.
No, but you not necessarily lie, but you have mismemories, or you think you're good, but you're not. Like so
yeah, but they were.
This could be. But
yeah, it could be, but they tested it thankfully.
I was already convinced with 40 Pokemon. Like this is shocking.
Yeah, it's so he had to prove that to make sure that was essential. The results showed that across a residual similarity matrix that I will show in a bit, across groups, he found that the Pokemon positive correlated really well with animals, as we would expect. So there was like a very good correlation with the animals itself. The mean was 0.2 in the voxels regions that they found, with a standard deviation of 0.11, which is pretty consistent. Significant across the group difference with the t-test. It shows a little bit of significance there, so there's a little bit of association with the animals, which one would expect. The Pokemon positive cohort, so he did also test to see if there was dissimilarity amongst in each of the groups that he found, whether it was people, places, cars, or the stuff that I have previously mentioned. He did find that these positive cohort. So after testing for dissimilarity, he did find that Pokemon itself was very different. He did actually have a significantly increase that Pokemon was actually very dissimilar from bodies, spaces, cars, and animals itself too, which is really interesting because while it is closer to animals itself, having Pokemon as an independent variable itself is interesting. That it shows up specifically in the brain. The Pokemon negative group was not statistically dissimilar amongst any of these groups, which is what we would expect. I mean, there's probably once the noise is cleared out, and the temporal cortex experience variability tested by was actually tested by an independent classifier that he used to actually later on be described as this independent rater. So the differential attention to Pokemon across groups is not the driving. He concluded that it's not the driving factor leading to distinct responsible organization of Pokemon stimuli in the VTC of experienced participants. So essentially, here we have the residual matrix at the top here, and you can see that there's like some mostly associate between the Pokemon positive and Pokemon negative. Wish Bradley was here because I did take his feedback and try to make the graphs much more visible this time around. As you can see, the best similarity and representation between the variables itself is Pokemon and animals. There is a little bit of a difference, but still there is still a striking independence of the variable Pokemon in Pokemon positive groups in comparison to the rest of the variables themselves. And so what he did to try to differentiate and figure out why this is the case is he used statistical parametric maps itself. He wanted to see that if the Pokemon itself actually was that different across all of the each one of the 11 participants, if it was exactly the same and how they were measured. it seems like there's some slight differences among the two, but not as striking as the differences between the positive and negative groups of the variable Pokemon. Once he applied these statistical parametric maps, he implemented these to contrast the response to each category versus all the others. So he used t-values and essentially just tried to use ANOVA to see the differences themselves. He also wanted to have independent raters to test to further test the variables that he defined later on as eccentricity, animicity, see how animated they are, and the size, and how the curvilinearity, which is essentially testing for whether it's your central or your peripheral vision, your foveal vision, and your central and your peripheral vision, because we tend to see our peripheral vision tends to be more rectangular, essentially, as opposed to curvular. When it's in the foveal, when it's in the middle of our eyesight versus on the edges. And so he wanted to do a test for that as well. What he did find is that some of the brains itself is that there is a difference between the difference in the abscess, which I'll show in a bit, of the brain between the lateral and medial axis of the mid foveal gyrus. So the Pokemon positive people, I think, had more lateral voxels as compared to the more horizontal. And preference to faces was found in the and it's important to know that the associations with these regions are peculiar and remarkable in the sense that preference to faces is typically not found in the lateral foveal gyrus. It's actually and also the preferences for places in the collateral sulculus is not typically where we see these associated tasks. So they had different tasks showing up in different regions of the brain. That makes sense to simplify. So the Pokemon stimuli that they found in the lateral foveal gyrus and the occipital temporal sulculus was actually found. Each one of these remarkable I guess not really artifacts. Phenomena was discovered. It was actually ubiquitous in each one of the Pokemon positive participants. So all 11 of these people had basically a weird different spots in their brain for identifying these tasks. He shows here in the graphs. Maybe I should have put these in there. Oh well. That the Pokemon positive participants were showed more a lateral region here in comparison to the controls and the Pokemon negative. As well as but then the faces seem very similar, if you can tell, as well as locations as well. So there's like a different region for identifying supposedly these pixelated creatures than otherwise noted. So we wanted to figure out why Pokemon are so different as opposed to like faces and yeah. Question?
No, but I'm just thinking, can we take a group of whatever 24-year-olds and train them for a week or two, make them play Pokemon, and see if we can drive their from Pokemon negative to Pokemon positive group up. Not because isn't it critical that they've done it in the childhood in the formative years? Or
yes. So what I will conclude to in like later after this white book, because you'll see it'll answer in a sec. How about that? I think that'll be. Because essentially, to answer your question now, it's like the area of, it has to do specifically with the area of the Game Boy and the age of the people that were actually present to the Game Boy itself. So and because there was repetition and at the time of development when their brain was still connecting, and because of the people foveated more on the Pokemon, which I'll get to in a sec, than the faces. So people just apparently the kids like Pokemon a lot more than actual faces. And so because of that repeated exposure and the age where they were at with the neuroplasticity they had, that drove essentially to that. So we wouldn't be able to do it now. If somebody was to do it now, or even play a different game, like if somebody would play, I don't know, any Pokemon game, not on the Game Boy Advance, if that makes sense, it wouldn't actually have these effects. What really drove spoiler at the end of the paper is like it's really central to the location of where the Game Boy was, how they're holding it from their faces, and then because and how the pixels were foveating their eyesight and the repeated exposure in their age. So that really drove it. So it wouldn't be able to. That really drove the I guess the neurotropic responses that we're seeing. So I guess it would say if we just had a random 20-year-olds that we wouldn't be able to do, their age wouldn't be the same. And I think that would be the main cursor, but we have to make everything else the exact same. So I guess the answer is no, it wouldn't work. So why Pokemon? When examined so he tried to look true because he actually recorded their eyesight too using PGF, I think it was, while they were identifying the Pokemon itself. And so he tried to see if there was after trying to figure out why this was, because as you can imagine, a student doing his PhD would probably be a little concerned that he's finding this thing and trying to see if there's any weird data. He examined some of the programs themselves and that they were tracking with the eyes, and found that people were actually using the similarity toolbox itself. He found that people were looking more at the Pokemon foveated on them than they were in the faces, and I'll show that graph in a second. And he actually looked at the voxels for that and actually compared the two tests themselves, and found that the results, as I posted right here, that was people are significantly foveated Pokemon as opposed to the faces themselves, which could be a number of things. Both Pokemon faces, which are a smaller retinal image, but because people focus on them so much, and that we look at them a lot more, and the center field of vision as opposed to our peripheral view of vision, our brain responses are more there's more stimuli in the brain for that region. So Pokemon are still perceived to be significantly more linear than faces, and I'll get to the linearity of that in a second. So we tend to foveate a lot more in Pokemon than faces. This is essentially why that occurred. And so to test this, just to be really skeptical, because he had to block for all these a ton, quite frankly, quite a bit of variables. He looked at he had 28 different independent raters come by and compared when shown 40 random Pokemon and asked to just basically come up with their real world size in comparison to what they really are. I mean, not really are, but like what the Pokemon manual reports them to be size wise, and he wants to make really careful that that this is not to do with retinal size, this is to do with perceived size. So how big do we think these Pokemon are when we see them, as opposed to like how big we think they are. He gave an ordinal scale of 1 to 7, and basically 1 being the smallest and 7 being the largest, clearly. And was asked to, and after all the independent raters themselves did this, he found that the people tend to think that the Pokemon in the game size were actually a lot larger than they were in real life, which makes more sense than the actual faces. So apparently when we see these animate monsters, we think they're a lot bigger. So he thinks that that's part of it, is there's an interaction between perception itself, interacting with the game, with the actual sensory components of the brain itself. And
so are you saying raters, so they were bigger than their description in the manual?
Yeah. So like
in the presentation you're saying average game size 1.2 meters, average rater size 0.82. What does game size mean? Is that coming from?
What we see in the how big they are. So like there's an actual manual that he cites actually in his paper. He actually cites
Bulbapedia?
Pardon?
Bulbapedia or another?
Like for example, Vileplume, I know this from childhood. Vileplume is 3'11" in height, but when you see a Pokemon itself on the screen, it's just going to be 2 by 5 centimeters versus 2 by 5 centimeters. And if I looked at Vileplume, I remember as a kid thinking, how tall am I compared to? I thought, oh, that's as tall as me at the time, and I wouldn't have thought that, because I would have thought Vileplume was a lot smaller. I guess I'm different from these people because the raters perceive these Pokemon to be a lot larger just from visualizing them, if that makes sense.
Wait, I mean,
So,
we are looking at whether they think it was bigger than its description from menu or smaller.
they thought it was bigger.
What is average game size?
Game size? Game size has to do with the Pokédex. So what they would say was the size, the actual recorded size.
Okay, so
versus
reported
50.
size on average is 1.2 meters. Plus minus 0.95.
Oh, that M, is that it? That's not meters, so that's
It's not, what is it?
that would have been that's to do with the statistical test they did, so that would they convert to I think for a Z-score for a standard deviation.
Hmm.
So that, yeah, that's not meters, sorry, I should have made that a little bit more clear. Apologies.
Do we have meter or inch data?
Yeah, we should. It was in feet, I think, off the top of my head. Based on the based on what he reported, it was a little vague on a lot of the variables, but I think he did the M itself, I think. So what I did is I essentially tried to take some of the statistics from the page itself. I think that's but there were some copy and paste errors that I had to correct. For example, what was it? Temporal, when you see in the slide, it says temporal occipital gyrus. There's I think that Microsoft inputted like a weird space in between the words for some reason. And so I had to correct that too, but I think that was a copy and paste error, to be perfectly honest from that. Yeah, so they perceived to be a lot larger than it actually was. That's the point I was trying to get across. Here are the graphs itself and versus perception versus well, not the perception itself. They thought that if you can see that the locations were a lot larger, the Pokemon kind of has like a weird discrepancy between the areas themselves. For example, Pokemon tend to be a lot larger, but there's variation amongst the data itself, which I want to point out too is kind of, I'll get to the end of my critiques of this paper itself, but there's variation amongst the sizes that we see. You can see that mostly people thought that corridors themselves were a lot larger than they were versus the faces themselves. Okay, and then he wanted to test the other variables too. So the next variable he wanted to test was the whether these perceptions were whether these people perceived these pixelated images to be animated or not. He defined animated more as lively, willing to move, if that makes sense. Perception of movement in space. Maybe I should put that in there too. But yeah, so he had 42 separate independent raters do that and rate from his ordinal variable of 0 to 5, and 40 random Pokemon, and then report what they found, what they perceived to what they would assume that Pokemon move. And what he found was this, but he found that the Pokemon were not as animate as if you can see, but more animate than they're more animate than the corridors themselves, somewhere within location, which is which makes a little bit more sense, as the Pokemon themselves could be seen to be a little more animate. He found too that the animate stimuli, well, I mean, it's typically known that animate stimuli is localized in the lateral, ventral, temporal cortex. And animate stimuli is usually found in the medial, ventral, temporal cortex. So that would make a lot more sense as to why Pokemon themselves are a little more animate than the locations themselves, because one's more about space and one's more about time, if that makes sense. And then so finally what he did to basically just to test these hypotheses, he used Pokemon, he took the Pokemon positive data and he used Tree Server to map out the cortical space of the Pokemon positive brains and Pokemon negative brains. He look at the noted 4 main differences between the two when he applied basically the Pokemon positive and the Pokemon negative, and then subtracted the Pokemon negative, essentially just what is it, to isolate just a Pokemon region itself. And he found 4 main reasons. So the preference for the Pokemon reliability localized in this Pokemon region is that he used from subtracting Pokemon positive from Pokemon negative is reliably in the occipital temporal sulcus itself. He found that Pokemon positive the preferred voxels, he created this Pokemon preferred voxel with a threshold of that was less than 3. And then he and like I said, he overlapped the voxels themselves to isolate this region itself. He also basically tried to isolate all other regions of stimuli and cells for this, and found and then also ran ANOVA testers of the factors that group the brain. But what he did find though, when comparing all of the individual Pokemon groups themselves, comparison to one another, he found that there was an increase in volume in the area in the occipital temporal sulcus itself, with the Pokemon positive patients, but he did but not a greater hemisphere. So it suggests that there is not that there's just a reassigning of where these tasks are located in the brain, as opposed to like a massive hyperencephaly, if that makes sense. Here is some of the data that he used from this researcher. You can see from the average contrast maps themselves, there is an overlap between the positive and negative that he used to extract a Pokemon region specifically. That he basically labeled a Pokemon region. You can see that's used. The next question he had is, are there emergent responses to Pokemon? Why did this I guess Pokemon region occur in the people that he saw and the people that he measured? And so what he did is he took 5 of the initial Pokemon positive cohort to test some of the questions, and used images of places for the Pokemon downsampled faces to block, and he found that the results were unremarkable between the people. So each of the patients themselves and the participants in Pokemon, well, in the regions of the brain, they were unable to. They were slightly different, but they're slightly different, but they were still much more different from the negative controls. Sorry, and then here is the responses that he found is that there's more lateral connectivity as opposed to horizontal connectivity in the brain, overlapping the BTC in the Pokemon positive regions of the brain. And he found that there was just a slight and he found that there was much more increase in these areas. Sorry. How does the visual experience change the responsiveness of the OTS to visual stimuli? Is the next thing he wanted to see. So he put both cohorts, as I described, into research for themselves. He used the Pokemon REI created by the cortical average, described in my CBA section to project controls of the brain. He as I previously described, he wanted to associate between a Pokemon and normal response, and he found that Pokemon, as opposed to the Pokemon positive group, as opposed to the Pokemon variable itself, as opposed to other categories, had low response to the cartoons and animals responses, the faces and bodies and other stimuli, and in the Pokemon negative area of the and then in the Pokemon negative cohort, Pokemon positive REI cohort showed that the highest amplitude of responses to animals and then cartoons and words, or pseudo words, because they weren't really, I mean, they're letters, and no were a response to stimuli. He also clarified the variable Pokemon selectability and observed that overlapping in the lateral faces, cortex, overlapping of lateral to the face section. He also demonstrated that this ROI is observed in the brain due to the overlapping of the cortex that he used in free server. You can see here is the voxels that they use for distinguishing foveations. If you can see that the more Pokemon based ones are more towards the center, which is more based on foveation itself, and the faces themselves are more peripheral as opposed to more center based. You can also see that, as I mentioned, how the unremarkable differences between the Pokemon positive patients, the areas of the brain, the deviations from each one of the standard deviation of each Pokemon. Basically, the difference in the Pokemon positive individuals with how different the Pokemon positive individuals are from each other. And as you can see, based on the gap here, there are some slight differences, but not in comparison to the overall negative group itself. So sorry about that. I'm experiencing some stomach issues. But the main thing I want to take away from this paper is that there is a eccentricity itself does seem to drive the organization of the the ventral temporal cortex itself, and that there is actually, and then it does seem to be environmentally triggered by more foveation as opposed to peripheral vision itself. He demonstrated this by trying to demonstrate different 4 dimensions in that he could then map out and test, and his cohort of 11 people, I guess 22 technically altogether, and demonstrate that there was a REI between the brain of an REI of Pokemon associated, independent from other independent from the other regions of interest that then is associated with Pokemon in the occipital sulculus. Some of the concerns I had about this paper was a little bit of a gender bias. So males, you typically, demonstrate that the adolescence, the brain changes in the growth obviously differs from when they're 14 in adolescence for males, opposed to the overall brain volume in females. Usually stops around starts at 10. And also the fact that the male volume of the brain is a little bit larger than the females on average, and how genes as yet actually affect the brain does kind of make me wonder why he only chose 3 females for the Pokemon experimental portion as opposed to the 7 in the control. It does seem like there's a little skewed. Also, the sample size is kind of low too, which did make me kind of think there's 11 for each group. It does seem kind of low to make something a big claim like this. And especially when you're dealing with more esoteric abstractions, it does seem like there is a lot of variability that can occur, and a lot of nonsensical noise that can occur when you're making these kind of measurements. So I do think that gender bias is a concern. I am kind of curious too if he looks for other phenomena in the area. I know there's been other papers tested on stuff like legal legends and cognitive ability, and I came with Western State from Ryan. And I'm curious if he can see any other correlations between the 2 data. Again, sorry about that. I'm having a little bit of stomach issues right now. But thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry.
No, thank you.
Any questions?
It's really great, interesting. But just a thought. So I understand this is child development, and the topic is interesting by itself. But where else this finding could be useful, or what else? Say there was a joke when all of this controllers, like kids were spending a lot of time with this motorics, the fine motorics games. The joke was, well, maybe at least they will make good surgeons or some neurosurgeons, or like so.
There's a paper on that. I have a paper. It's with 2D spatial organization, and it's all games. They tested everything from. Yeah, it was interesting. Sorry, there's a paper I found on that too. It's
Yeah, like where could this be? Like what is a like are those people affected in their daily life by, say, having some preferential abilities to certain jobs compared to people who didn't play Pokemon that extensively at that specific age? And,
Yeah.
like
It's interesting because this particular region has to do with like distinguishing categorization from visual stimuli. So I don't know how that could fit into a everyday life. But I mean, and also I want to point out that the change is really tiny too. And like it sounds very commercialized to say Pokemon region of the brain. But as I pointed out from like the graphs, that's why I wanted to make sure I showed those. It's a tiny slight sliver of 11 individuals that averaged out from a residual representational similarity matrix and a free server. So I mean, I think it requires further study, to be honest. He did mention though too that it was gameplay color, so it has to do with the proportional similarities of holding it far away from your face too, that he mentioned. I do kind of wonder how that varies because kids do, especially grow differently between 5 and adulthood. So I was kind of curious how he blocked for that. But I guess further studies will show if there are any others.
so one last question: why did you choose that paper? Because it's fun, or was
I
it?
thought it was an interesting one. I thought it was really interesting from a visual point of view. I think it was when it came out. Actually, I've been asking this question for a long time. Like, why am I into this stuff? And like, there's not like a reason to be. I can objectively tell that it's not that good. I'm like, is it nostalgia? Is it this? And I think I was listening to a Science Friday, I think during my a couple of years ago, and this came on. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And I looked at it, and then I looked at the paper, and I was really impressed with how formal he presented it, and how he really tried to block out each one of the variables itself. And I thought it was really interesting to think about that people really fixated on certain things and not others. And that's what really kind of drove the organization of our perception. So it's more of a perception, a mix of nostalgia, perception, and where I was at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, thanks for volunteering to present it. That's very interesting paper, and yeah. Well, thanks everyone who came, and see you next Friday.